10 longest prison sentences served by innocent people. Can you imagine spending years in prison for a crime you didn't commit? Hell, most people complain about spending an hour in a holding cell when they're guilty. Here are the 10 longest prison sentences served by innocent people. 10. James Richardson, 21 years. Back in 1967, James Richardson was convicted of killing 7 of his own children. He was initially arrested for poisoning his children and causing their deaths. The prosecutor indicted him for murder, and the jury convicted him and sentenced him to a life in prison. He spent 21 long years in prison. All that time, he was looked at as a man who had killed his own children. Finally, an appeal was filed by Richardson's attorney, Ellis Rubin, and special prosecutor Janet Reno in 1988. They argued that Richardson hadn't received a fair trial. James Richardson was a black man, and the entire jury that convicted him was white. It was found during his appeal that Richardson had not in fact hurt his children. He was finally released from prison and returned to his hometown of Arcadia, Florida at the ripe old age of 77. If you think that was bad, wait till you hear how bad the jury got it wrong in this next case. 9. Daryl Burton, 24 years. Any case where the only witness is a police informant could end up in an innocent man being committed. In 1983, a man named Donald Moe Ball had been shot in the arm by a rival gang member named Jesse Watson. Just a few months later, Ball was gunned down while filling his green Oldsmobile 98 at an Amoco station at the corner of Delmar and Goodfellow. Ball had died. About a month later, a prison snitch and a police informant fingered Daryl Burton for the crime. Burton was a very dark-skinned, 5'10" male. In fact, he was so dark-skinned that his playground nickname had been Lights Out. The only eyewitnesses to the crime said the man who shot Ball was a very short, light-skinned black man, standing about 5'5". At the time, Burton was a parolee who had spent 2 years in the local county jail for armed robbery. He had never been accused of a crime as serious as murder, though. He was arrested and charged with the crime against Ball. He sat in jail from 1984 until 2008, when new evidence finally cleared Burton of the crime and he was released. Thankfully, DNA evidence was able to clear an innocent man of charges after spending 25 years in prison. Take a look at this next story. 8. Stephen Phillips. Stephen Phillips was convicted of rape in 1983. He was given a life sentence and sat in jail for a quarter of a century. At the time Phillips was arrested, people had complained that the police had the wrong guy, but once the police set their sights on Phillips, they stopped looking for other suspects. After being convicted, the Innocence Project took on Phillips' case and were determined to get him justice. They relied on DNA evidence that was available and ignored at the time of Phillips' conviction. There was actually proof that the police hid evidence that would have proven that the crimes were committed by a man named Sidney Alvin Goodyear. Goodyear was eventually charged and convicted of the crime based on the suppressed evidence. At the time he was finally released in 2008, Phillips had been the first innocent man to spend 25 years in prison. When the DNA evidence cleared him of the crime in 2008, he was released from prison. He sued the state and was awarded $4.1 million. If you ever get charged with a crime, make sure it's not in Dallas County. This next man became the 15th innocent man to have been sentenced to life in prison in Dallas County. Check it out here.
Number 7.
Charles Chapman. Charles Chapman was just 20 years old when he was charged with raping a white woman in Dallas County. In January of 1981, a 52-year-old white woman reported that an African American had broken into her apartment. The man was wearing a dark cap over his head. He forced the woman to undress and proceeded to rape her. Before he left, he tied her up with scarves and made her lie face down on the floor. The man stole $15 in cash and a few other items from her apartment. Apparently, the perpetrator made several flights in and out of the apartment, carrying stuff out to his car. The woman described her attacker as a black man with facial hair. She said he was about 5'7" tall, but she wasn't wearing her glasses at the time of the attack, but claimed she remembered what the guy looked like. She never mentioned anything about the attacker having no teeth. Charles Chapman has no teeth. He had lost them in a football accident when he was younger. The victim identified Chapman in a lineup, and he was charged with the crime. When they tested the semen found on the victim's bed, all they could say for sure was that it matched about 40% of all black men. Despite the fact that Chapman met his attorney a total of 1 time before trial, and there was proof that he was at work at the time of the crime, he was reported and sentenced to 99 years in prison. In January of 2008, DNA testing proved that Chapman had not committed the rape. He was finally released from prison after missing out on almost 30 years. This next guy missed out on a professional career in baseball due to a false conviction. Check it out next. 6. William Dillon. In August of 1981, a man named James Dorak was beaten to death in Florida. Right after the beating, a man picked up a hitchhiker who was wearing a yellow t-shirt covered in blood. The driver agreed to take the hitchhiker to a bar 3 miles down the road. The driver was partially blind and didn't get a good look at the man. Before he dropped him off, the driver performed oral sex on the guy. During the act, the hitchhiker took off the t-shirt and left it in the guy's car. After dropping him off, the driver threw the t-shirt in the local dumpster. When he heard about the crime the next day, he called the cops and told them about the hitchhiker. He also took them to the trash can and gave them the bloody t-shirt. 5 days later, the cops interviewed baseball prospect William Dillon. They said they thought it was suspicious that he knew about the crime, despite the fact that everyone knew about the crime by that point. He was arrested for the crime and charged with murder. The only witnesses were the blind driver and a dog handler who said his tracking dog connected Dillon to the crime. 27 years later, DNA evidence proved that Dillon had nothing to do with the crime. He was released from prison thanks to the help of the Innocence Project. It seems like 1983 was a bad year for innocent people. Here is another guy who was convicted in 1983 of a rape he didn't commit. 5. Michael Green. Back in 1983, 4 men kidnapped a woman from a payphone in Houston and took her off to a remote area where they raped her. The men took off on foot and there was a chase by police. The only man they stopped was Michael Green, a man who just happened to be walking in the area at the time. There was no physical evidence to tie the man to the rape. No other men were ever caught. At first, the victim said she didn't recognize Green as one of her attackers. However, later in a lineup, she suddenly was able to identify Green as one of the men who assaulted her. No other men were ever charged for the crime. There were no other witnesses involved. Michael Green was convicted of the crime and sentenced to life in prison. At the time of the crime, the victim had been wearing a pair of jeans that contained DNA that would have tied all 4 perpetrators to the crime. The jeans sat in an evidence locker for over 27 years. When they were finally tested, they found that Michael Green's DNA was not on the jeans. They did tie the DNA to 4 other men who were in prison at the time. Since it had been so long, they weren't able to charge the men with the crimes. The statute of limitations had already expired. Michael Green was released and was awarded $2.2 million, $80,000 a year for every year this guy spent in prison. This poor guy died less than a year after he was declared innocent. 4. Glenn Ford. In 1983, a white jewelry shop owner was shot in the back and killed in a robbery gone wrong. Glenn Ford was charged with the crime. Ford did have a history of drug crimes, but he had never been known as a violent man. When he got out of jail for his drug offenses, he returned to Shreveport, Louisiana. He did odd jobs to support himself, including doing yard work for the victim. 3 days after the victim died, someone claimed that Ford had been caught pawning some of the stolen items at a local pawn shop. Ford and 3 other black men were arrested and tried for the crime. Ford's case was handled by 2 rookie lawyers who had never handled a murder case. The jury who convicted him was all white. For a black man in Louisiana, things didn't bode well. Ford was convicted of murder and sent to prison. It wasn't until 30 years later, at the age of 64, that Ford was cleared of all charges and released from prison. The poor guy died 1 year later at the age of 65. Can you imagine spending more than half your life in prison for a crime you didn't commit and then to die just 1 year later? Yeah, neither can we. Here goes another Dallas man convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Things really are bigger in Texas, especially the screw-ups. 3. Cornelius Dupree Jr. In 1979, a white couple entered a store to buy a pack of cigarettes. The 26-year-old woman decided to use the payphone while her friend went in the store. She noticed 2 black men coming towards the payphone. The next thing she knew, the men forced her back to her car. They forced her boyfriend in the car and made him drive. The men robbed both the woman and her friend before throwing the friend out of the car. They then proceeded to rape the woman and left her unconscious on the side of the road. A police officer noticed her body and took her to the hospital. A week later, Cornelius Dupree was walking down the road with a friend of his. The two men were questioned about the crime. The victims were asked if they looked familiar. The man said neither man looked like the perpetrators. The woman did pick Dupree and his friend out of a lineup. At trial, both the man and the woman claimed to remember Dupree as the man who robbed them. DNA evidence found a fur coat that the men had stolen couldn't rule Dupree out as a suspect. With no other evidence than this, Dupree was convicted and sentenced to prison. He spent more than 30 years in prison before DNA evidence finally released him in 2010. This guy spent 35 years in prison. You don't want to miss this one. 2. James Bain. In 1974, James Bain was charged with kidnapping and rape. He was sentenced to life in prison. Bain sat in prison for over 35 years before he could finally convince the court to perform DNA testing of the rape kit collected 35 years earlier. When DNA analysis was done, it proved that Bain was not the man who had committed the crime. Most people would have been angry as hell, but Bain said he wasn't mad. He said there was nothing he could do to change these things. He compared himself to Joseph in the Bible and said he was grateful for his experiences. Talk about no good deed going unpunished. Wait till you see what happened to our next guy. I saved the best for last, but first I have a quick challenge that takes only 5 seconds to complete. So if you can leave a like and subscribe within the next 5 seconds, you'll get 10 years of amazing luck. Just try it. It really works. 1. Lewis Taylor. In 1970, Lewis Taylor was charged with arson and for killing 29 people who died in a hotel fire in Arizona. Taylor was convicted of the crime and sentenced to life in prison. The kick in the ass was at the time he was arrested. Taylor was actually rescuing people from the fire. He had saved the lives of many people trapped in the hotel, yet he was the man charged with the crime. He was only a teenager at the time. Finally, in 2013, Taylor was released from prison when they realized they had convicted the wrong guy. Sadly, Taylor had a hard time adjusting to life outside the prison system. At the age of 65, he was arrested and convicted of a crime he did commit: armed robbery. I hope you enjoyed the video today, and if you did, well, it's your lucky day. For every single person that likes this video, we'll let you spend one night in prison. Thanks for watching, and have an excellent day.